We are Group CST1, and this is our behavior change project on decreasing bouts of prolonged sitting among office workers. And I am Treasure Cunningham.
My name is Stern Harris.
My name is Catherine Hughes.
I'm Katie Larson.
And I am Trina Stocks.
So the original study that we're trying to replicate was from Green, Sigurdsson, and Wilder in 2016. The purpose of their study was to test 3 different behavioral interventions and see if, at the end of their study, if there was a decrease in bouts of sitting among office workers. They chose 3 female office workers who did not know each other, did not work together. Their ages ranged from 20 to 59. The middle age was 44. And the participants reported that 85% of their day was spent sitting, where only 4 to 5% of it was actually spent standing. They used a device. It was a belt called an actigraph, which was worn throughout the entire study. They put it on at the beginning of their day and were allowed to take it off when their work period was over. The phases that they used were information, tactile, and then the third intervention was the tactile feedback and goal setting phase. So for baseline, the participants wore this actigraph belt, accelerometer, to track sedentary behavior. So this belt was able to send the information into an Excel spreadsheet to the researchers, and the participants were blind to this part of the study. So baseline, it counted as a bout of sitting if the participant spent more than 30 minutes in a sedentary state. So if they spent more than 30 minutes sitting down at their computer, not doing anything, that would count as 1 bout of sitting. When the researchers saw that there was a period where the data leveled out, that's when they went on to the next phase of the study, which was information. On the first day of this phase, the researchers presented the participants with some reading material explaining the health risks for having long periods of sitting in the workplace. So that was the only difference about this phase from baseline. Data continued to be tracked without the participants knowing how many bouts of sitting they had. They just, on the first day of this phase, they were giving that reading material, and the researchers graphed to see if there was a difference between behavior in those 2 phases. The next phase for this was the tactile prompt. So at the 30-minute mark for this study, in the tactile phase, they would wear a device that would vibrate and tell them to stand up. So what the participants didn't know is that there was a minute window for if they stood up and started walking around, then even if they had been sitting for 30 minutes, it would not count as a bout of sitting if they used that 1 minute period to stand up and stretch their legs and be a little bit more active. They were not told this by the researchers. Once they saw that there was an area where the behavior leveled off and did not increase or decrease to a significant degree, they went ahead to the next phase, the tactile feedback and goal setting. So on the morning of this phase, for each day of this phase, they continued to have the tactile prompt where the device that they would wear would vibrate and send them a message to stand up, but they also would get feedback from the researcher describing what the average bout of sitting was for the previous day and ask them to set a goal to decrease those bouts by 50%. So if they were sitting if they had 4 bouts of sitting the previous day, the researcher would come back the next morning and say, hey, so you had 4 bouts of sitting. That was great. That was an improvement. But hey, let's cut it down to 2 bouts of sitting this next time. Then they concluded the study, and they did show that there was a decrease from baseline to the last phase of the study, the tactile feedback and goal setting across all participants. The average duration decreased, and productivity also remained consistent. There was no decrease in productivity.
So for our literature review, our first article is by Baker et al. They looked at short-term musculoskeletal and cognitive effects of prolonged sitting during office computer work. They had participants sit for 2 hours at a computer desk, and over the 2 hours, the researchers completed various assessments and tests. They were mostly looking at 9 body areas rated on the Nordic Musculoskeletal Questionnaire, and then they used a couple response tests to see if participants started responding at a slower rate over the 2 hours. Their studies did show that all participants felt discomfort across all areas of the body, but most discomfort was in the lower back and the hip, thigh, and buttock area. There was also a decrease in creative problem-solving errors over time and a negative impact on mental state. The only area they did not see any change was in sustained attention.
So for our second article, the study really focused on wanting to see the long-term effects of people that are over the age of 60 that were obese or overweight, just their different health conditions and depressive symptoms. So other studies have been done in the past studying the effects of sedentary behavior. So sitting for longer periods of time, lying down, things to that extent. So this study lasted for a period of 8 weeks. And to start off in the baseline phase, the participants wore a hip-worn device or a thigh-worn device to track their physical activity. And so once that data was collected, the experimenters were able to go back in and track their intervention from there. So they had a health coach that would call them every so often and check up in on their behaviors. So if they were able to stand more, if they were able to track their sitting and standing behaviors, and the health coach was able to motivate the participants to want to stand more. So the participants were able to decrease their sitting time by about 27 minutes a day on average. They were able to increase their standing transitions to about 2 times per day. And their standing in general increased to 25 minutes a day, and their moderate to vigorous physical activity improved, and their depressive symptoms did decrease. So overall, the conclusion stated that reducing sitting time is feasible for older adults and adults that are obese.
All right, and for this article, the researchers took Dinesh Mondi and et al. Took a study of Iranian office workers and set out to see if there was a correlation between time spent sitting in a sedentary state and other things such as the feeling of exhaustion, job satisfaction, and the risk of hypertension. So the results of their study showed that the average range for their sample was almost 7 hours, 6.47, so a little less, during an 8-hour shift of them sitting in sedentary states, not being particularly active. And they did show that this increased their risk of hypertension, their job satisfaction levels, and even throughout the day, not necessarily the beginning or end, but just throughout the middle of the day, they felt exhausted. They took a Nordic musculoskeletal questionnaire, and it did show that over the past 12 months, they did have complaints of their lower back, shoulder symptoms, like predominantly across the sample, lower back and shoulders were much more tense and held more pain than some of other people that did not have these long bouts of sitting. So this study is just kind of going to show that even with little breaks in between your time in the office, if you do spend a lot of time sitting, or someone you know spends a lot of time sitting, taking small breaks where you aren't sitting for these long hours at a computer, not moving, may increase some of these they may decrease some of these deficits. And even if you aren't working out 3 times a week, decreasing those longer bouts may help with those things. Your mic.
Our next article is a 2017 article by McGowan, Saunders, and McDonald and Burr. This is titled Sit, Stand, Desk to Reduce Workplace Sitting Time in Office Workers with Abdominal Obesity, a randomized control trial. In this article, that was 12 weeks in treatment, this was about a goal of decreasing sedentary behavior in the workplace. This treatment was not conducted outside of the workplace in the home. It was literally just in the workplace and during business hours. The randomized control group were provided with a sit-stand workstation where they would alternate. The results showed that the intervention group experienced significant reductions in sitting time over the 12-week period.
Moving into our last literature review is an article by Hutchinson and others. It took place in 2018. This study examined the effect of a personalized intervention on sedentary behavior. There were 36 total participants in the study, and all of them were in college. Each college employee was designated a personalized behavioral intervention, which aimed to decrease the number of bouts of sitting that they had, each one consisting of 30 minutes. So each bout of sitting would be 30 minutes long. This particular study found that a personalized intervention to decrease bouts of sitting was helpful over their whole day overall, but not during the work day. Overall, the bouts of sitting decreased by 0.52 times per day. And the results found that a personalized sedentary behavioral intervention was successful in reducing the number of bouts of sitting that were greater than 30 minutes of sitting. Overall, the bouts of sitting decreased on average by about half a bout per day. Then we'll move into the purpose of our project, which shows examines a article by Green, Segurden, and Wilder. We just discussed the original study, and their whole point was that over 2/3 of Americans are considered overweight, and a portion of that Americans are obese. And part of the reason that we're experiencing that is because there's an increased amount of time sitting. If you think about how our culture has changed over the decades, we have more people than ever sitting at desks than doing more work on their feet. So the Green and others articles uses the definition of sedentary behavior as activities that do not increase energy expenditure substantially above the resting level, such as sleeping, sitting, lying down, watching television, and other forms of screen-based entertainment. Along with some of the detrimental effects of sedentary behavior, it can increase the risk of premature death. So with the increased bouts of prolonged sitting in the workplace, there's research showing that taking a break from sitting can have some health benefits. The Green and others study seeks to assess the impact, as we said in the original study, of information, tactile prompts, and goal setting. And the purpose of our project was to replicate this as closely as possible. There are numerous studies that focus on healthy behaviors inside and outside the workplace, but this study in particular studies the way that we can decrease prolonged bouts of sitting in the workplace.
Okay, so now we're going to move into our methods section. Participants were 5 students recruited from Ball State University's Advanced Applied Behavior Analysis course. The age range was from 25 to 33 years old. There's 1 male and 4 female participants. The setting took place in the natural environment, which included home, work, or other community settings. Materials used were alarm clock apps on cell phones, stopwatches, computers, and data sheets. All of the participants in this replication study had different devices that track movement differently or didn't track movement at all, and so we chose to use the alarm clock apps on our cell phones just so we were as consistent as possible throughout the project. Our behavior and our definition. Our behavior was a bout of sitting. The definition for that is defined as any 30-minute interval during the 8-hour observation period of sedentary behavior activities that do not increase energy expenditure substantially above resting level. So this included sleeping, sitting, lying down, watching TV, and other forms of screen-based entertainment. A bout of sitting would not be counted if the participant spends at least 30 seconds engaging in physical activity, such as standing, walking, or exercising during any stage of the 30-minute interval. The 30 seconds of physical activity is cumulative and does not require 30 concurrent seconds. An example for this behavior would be sitting on a couch in front of the TV for a period of 30 minutes without standing or moving in a manner that requires a substantial amount of energy. A non-example would be walking outside for over a minute to go check your mail. Data collection, we used partial interval recording to track bouts of sitting for 8-hour periods for 5 days a week. Wednesday through Friday, we tracked from the hours of 12 to 8, and on Saturday and Sunday, we tracked from the hours of 10 to 6. Each participant in this study used self-monitoring to take data for these intervals. And this picture is an example of what our data sheets looked like for each day. Our design for the study was a multiple baseline across participants.
So I'll go into the detail about what each phase looked like. So as Katie said, the alarms were set at 30-minute intervals during each of the observation periods. So for 8 hours, 5 days a week, Wednesday through Sunday. And like she said, the majority of us had jobs that were very active throughout our Wednesday through Friday. So we wanted to kind of get those an extra 2 days of what our weekends would look like and see what the difference of levels of sedentary or bouts of sitting were on Saturday and Sunday. We used stopwatches to record whenever we would stand during these periods, so that if we sat down before reaching that 30-second mark, that we would know how much we had stood during those brief periods that were less than 30 seconds. When stability in the data was demonstrated, we would move on to the second phase. So just like the original study, on day one of the intervention phase, whenever we moved into this, we were provided reading material from one of the participants, and just detailing the increased health risks associated with prolonged bouts of sitting. And we actually got this reading material from the original study. It was one of the articles that was in the references for the original study. No other changes occurred during the information phase. We continued to track data the same way as we did in baseline. It was just day one, we were provided this information for reading material. For the next phase, it was the tactile prompt. So because we did not have an accelerometer, we used alarms on our cell phones set at the 29-minute mark at this phase. So instead of, whereas in the baseline phase, we would have alarms at the 30-minute mark, and we'd go ahead and record if we had a bout of sitting the last 30 minutes, just like the original article. By setting an alarm at the 29-minute mark, we would give ourselves a 1-minute opportunity to, if we hadn't stood up for the past 29 minutes, we could stand up and receive a not bout of sitting. We would not count it if we had at least 30 minutes of standing or physical activity. So when we had stability in this phase, when the graph showed that it was relatively stable, we would go ahead and move on to the last phase of the intervention, which is the tactile feedback and goal setting. So we would continue to track, just as we had in the tactile phase, the 29-minute mark with the 1-minute prompt to stand up if we hadn't been standing. And additionally, on day one of this phase, we calculated the average bouts of sitting for each participant on the tactile phase. So on day one of this last phase, we would provide each participant the total or the average for the bouts of sitting that they had, and set a goal, or ask them to set a goal to decrease those bouts of sitting by 50%. And then as the phase continued, so day two, the goal would be 50% of the previous day rather than the average from the last phase. So each day, hopefully, you would have a goal of less bouts of sitting compared to the previous day. Feedback was also in the form of positive reinforcement. Participants had separate days that they were scheduled to send a message to the group, giving them feedback, and also giving that positive reinforcement, and using that group activity and group forming to help increase success. For IOA, on Wednesday and Sunday of every week, so the first day of data collection for a week and the last day of data collection for a 5-day period, we would record a 30-second video of ourselves during sometime during the observation period, and send it in a group text to the other members. After viewing the video, the participants would respond privately to the person that had sent the video and tell them whether the 30-second video was a bout of sitting or not a bout of sitting. So this way, each participant was able to look at the operational definition for a bout of sitting and measure, okay, is this 30-second video that I'm watching indeed a bout of sitting or not? And that's why we would send it privately. The person that originally sent a video would collect data from the other members and record whether they had said that accurately. For treatment fidelity, we were required to have at least, even though a full observation period was 8 hours, if someone forgot to set their alarms, we did have a minimum of 7 hours in length that we were required to have our bouts of sitting. So if you forgot to set your alarms and it was already less than 7 hours for the observation period, we would not count any of the data from that sample. Additionally, each participant was assigned a week where 2 times during that week, they would text the other members in the group and ask them if they had set alarms that day and if they had been tracking their bouts of sitting. So each participant got to choose whether it would be maybe the first 2 days out of that 5-day period or the first and last day out of that 5-day period. As long as there were 2 days that someone was doing the treatment fidelity, we would not have to have the same days each week.
So these are my results. As you can tell just by looking at the graph, overall I did have a decreased amount of sitting. During my baseline, my average bouts of sitting per session were 5.2. Overall, at the end of the experiment, my total average for bouts of sitting were 3.29 during a session. It is important to note that for my graph, as a group, we decided to throw out data on day 22 or 23, which is why it is missing. This was because that was a Saturday and Sunday. On both of those days, I was doing extensive traveling and was not provided with an opportunity to stand as I was sitting in a vehicle for the majority of the day. Had I been provided with the opportunity to stand, I would have, which would have altered my data. But overall, I did very well. Baseline is a little variable information. I started going down. Tactile was pretty fluid. And then in my final phase, the last 3 days, I actually incurred in 0 bouts of sitting each day.
Hi, everybody. For my results, I also experienced a decrease overall from my baseline to the end with the tactile feedback and goal setting. As you can see from the graph, I just wanted to draw my attention to a couple outliers I had, especially in the tactile phase. In session 11, I had a big spike in my data, and also in session 15. During that week, I was on vacation and had more time sitting. I wasn't at my regular job, and so there was different spikes during those times. But overall, you can see that my data went down from baseline.
All right, so for my results, I had a decrease in bouts of sitting from baseline through all the phases to the end of the goal setting phase. I started out in baseline with an average of 3.4 bouts per day. I had a slight increase in the information phase of 4.2 bouts, But then once we entered in our tactile phase, that average went to 2.29 bouts per day. And then my goal setting phase, I had 0 bouts every day of that phase. So overall, the treatment was effective for me to decrease my bouts of sitting.
Treasurer's mic.
So, sorry guys, I was muted. So for my results, I was able to decrease my bouts of sitting as well. In my baseline phase, I was able to have 3 bouts of sitting, 3.6 bouts of sitting. And by the time I got to the goal setting phase, I was able to decrease my bouts of sitting to 0% or average. My baseline phase had the most bouts of sitting that my graph will show you. On the second day, or second session rather, I was up to 6 bouts of sitting. And as the graph goes on, in my tactile prompt phase, I had 4 bouts of sitting on the 12th day. And from that point on, I was able to decrease. I think that having the goal setting, being able to tell my colleagues like, okay, today I had 0 bouts of sitting, so tomorrow I want to have 0 bouts of sitting, really did help to stay on the path of decreasing my bouts of sitting.
All right. For my data, you can see that by the end, the tactile prompt, feedback, and goal setting was indeed very effective. As far as baseline goes, even though you can see a decrease, the average is over there on the left-hand side of this slide. Average for baseline was 19%, information 17%, and continues to dwindle down where the goal setting or the last phase has the 1% average. For baseline, I should have had more data points to show because obviously you want to introduce an intervention if the data was on a decrease. And we'll talk about more about that in the limitations section. But we were on a time crunch and we did have to move a little bit more quickly through our data due to when we had to finish data collection. But anyway, overall, the goal setting phase really decreased, and for the last 4 sessions recording, I did have 0 bouts of sitting.
Okay, so we did have a few limitations, but we tried to work through them as best as we could just to keep our data going and to really just focus in and get our study done. So our first limitation was the fact that we did not have the same type of watch or device to prompt us to stand up. We were using the app on our phones that had alarm clocks and also the vibration for the tactile phase. We did not have the hip-worn attachment as they did in the original study to track our physical activity. We also did not have an experimenter to deliver the feedback and goal setting. In the study, they had an experimenter come in person and give them their feedback at 8 a.m. or either email them by 8 a.m. to give them their feedback and to help them to set their goals. So we ended up, like previously mentioned, using the videos to track ourselves, and then we were given the feedback from our other colleagues on if we were showing a bout of sitting or a bout of standing, and then we set our own goals based off of the previous day of what our goal was, and we then lowered that by 1 bout of sitting. So since we could not meet in person, it was harder, and since we don't work together, it was harder for us to be able to have 5 days a week consecutively, like that they had to be able to track our data. So we did split it up from Wednesday to Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday, just so on Saturday and Sunday, we could really make up for the times that we weren't standing if we were at work and we did not have the ability to stand up while working. So we were traveling. Some of us did have to go on different trips during this whole process. So we were not able to stand up as much as we would have liked to. I know personally I was on a plane, and so I knew that I wouldn't stand for at least 4 hours altogether through that trip. So that did, bump down our time that we could be standing up. Our earlier baseline data did have to be thrown out because we were taking our IOA data insufficiently. So we started taking data on February 13th, and we were taking pictures to post to the group chat for our colleagues to be able to tell us if we were sitting or standing. And this was not the best way that we could have been taking our data. So we decided on February 22nd that we would start over and use our phone's video recording system to record us standing for at least 30 seconds or sitting down for at least 30 seconds and showing our environment and where we were. And since we had to scratch the beginning data, we were not able to complete as much time as we wanted to in each phase for having so many data points. We were able to have 5 data points for each phase, but we would have liked to have more to mimic the study.
Overall, every participant showed a decreased amount of sitting, proving that this is an effective treatment to use for decreasing sedentary behavior and increasing standing behavior. For all 5 participants also, we saw the most decreased amounts of bouts in the goal setting phase, to where we were holding each other accountable for, hey, did you meet your goals, and giving positive reinforcement for meeting those goals. With that being said, although overall we did have a decreased amount of setting, the data collection itself was a little tedious. It's recommended for future research that you do a different data collection method. We used pen and paper to track our bouts of sitting every 30 minutes, and just with the type of work being within ABA and special needs, it was tedious to keep up with our personal data collection and working environment. So it is recommended that you formulate a more efficient data collection. That being said, sometimes better data collection and methods are done in a controlled environment instead of different environments. So, for example, some of our environment settings were done while we were at work and while we were at home. Just making it a little bit easier, a little bit more difficult in each area. It is also recommended that your method collection, or your data collection method, be for duration instead of partial interval recording. When you are graphing, you will notice in our graphs that it appears that we have a lot of variability in our data, and this, we have concluded, is because of the different environments. So for example, Wednesday through Friday, we were all in a work environment where we are very active. so bouts of sitting were less likely to occur. On the weekends, however, Saturday and Sunday, we were more than likely to increase our setting behaviors. So because of that, each phase, it was a little difficult to get solid data in order to move to the next phase. So it is recommended that if you do your treatment across different environmental settings, that you graph them separately. So for example, all data points that occurred on a Monday through Wednesday should be on graph 1, and all data points that occurred on Saturday and Sunday should be on graph 2. That way you can more collectively look at the data and see if there is a true decrease and a true effective treatment for each phase. With that being said, on behalf of myself and the rest of us in our group, we would like to thank you for taking the time to watch our video, and we wish you the best of luck with yours.